Alright, hello boys and girls. Today we are going to be looking at literary devices. This is going to be the first video in a series of two. So, let's have a quick look. What are literary devices? Well, literary devices are basically terms which are used to describe certain aspects, ideas, and tools within literature. They are essentially techniques of analyzing different aspects of what people have written. And for this course, you are expected to know them all. You need to be familiar with their usage and their application within a text, and they will be regularly referred to in all exams in both English 1 and English 2. So, this is an example of most of the terms that we will be looking at. They all refer to different ideas, and over the following videos, I will just try to quickly introduce all of them very briefly, and then following that, there will be other videos specifically referring to certain devices. So the first thing that we're going to look at in literature is the character. Now, when we say a character, we refer to any person or animal that takes part in the action of a literary work. Characters are divided into categories. For example, the first category is the antagonist. The antagonist is the main baddie, although he doesn't necessarily have to be evil per se. The morals don't necessarily have anything to do with it. It all depends on the focus of the piece of work that you are reading. But rather, the antagonist is the character who is trying to prevent the main character, or the protagonist, from carrying out whatever it is they wish to do. Their primary enemy, the creator of the primary force of conflict within the story. So the antagonist is the main opposer, the main bad guy. Take a minute and try to think of some stories from movies or television shows or video games. The antagonist is the main character in conflict with the protagonist. Now, the protagonist is the main character in a piece of work, the main hero, if you like. He is obviously the most easily identifiable character within the story. And I'm sure that you could list off any number of protagonists from any number of stories off the top of your heads. Now, diction. Diction is the manner in which a word is expressed. Essentially, it's the enunciation. A simple example would be, instead of saying goin', saying going. Or you don't say wanna, you say I want to. These are examples of correct enunciation. The denotation of a word is its dictionary meaning. Essentially, it describes the actual meaning of the word, irrespective of any other ideas associated with it. And the connotation is a set of ideas that are associated with that word. So if we look at an example, we know that cheap means it doesn't cost very much. However, it can also mean that something is badly made or is of a low quality. These are all connotations of cheap. Hot is another example, as in hot directly means that has a high temperature or higher than that of the human body. However, it also can mean that someone is very beautiful or very attractive. Now, imagery. Imagery within literature basically describes whenever a use of the 5 or more senses are made. So, in other words, whenever a writer describes what something looks like, or sounds like, or feels like, or tastes like, or smells like, that would be an example of imagery used within the text. Mood. The mood is the atmosphere or the feeling that is created by a piece of writing. It essentially describes how we feel when we read the text. And usually what a writer tries to do is to create a mood at the start and then try and sustain it throughout the whole text. But obviously, it can change radically within the text itself. The plot. When we talk about the plot, we are referring to a sequence of events, essentially that the first causes the second, which causes the third, which causes the fourth, etc., etc. It's basically the actions or events that take place that create the story. And the plot usually, although not always, of course, follows a general trend and can in fact be broken down into specific sections. This would be a plot line, so we are still linked into plot. And a plot line or a plot diagram is essentially made up of 5 elements. You can see them outlined on the screen. The exposition, the rising action, the climax, the falling action, and the resolution. And at some point, conflict is introduced to create the rising action. We'll talk about each of these in detail. The exposition is essentially the introduction of the story. It is where we are introduced to the setting, we are introduced to the characters. The writer tries to create the mood and describes the basic situation of everything of the story. The rising action is the part of the plot that starts as soon as the conflict is introduced. Essentially, it adds complications and creates a problem that usually the protagonist has to try and solve, and an attempt is made to stop him from solving it by the antagonist. So the rising action is a build-up of this constant battle between the protagonist and the antagonist, attempting to solve the problem and building up the tension. And this builds up and builds up until we reach the climax. The climax is the point of the greatest emotional intensity or suspense in the story or in the narrative, and it is usually a turning point in the story or in the drama, usually the most important part of the story. The falling action is essentially the action that follows the climax and shows us the results of that climax. It's a gradual winding down of events. And the resolution is the part of the story that concludes everything that has taken place before it. All the loose ends are tied up, all the problems are solved, and they lived happily ever after. So, thank you for listening. This concludes this first video on literary devices, and it will be followed up with a second one. Thank you.